The show's guest, Austin Peterson, is a registered representative of Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation, broker-dealer member SIPC, and registered investment advisor. The views expressed by Austin are not necessarily the views of Lincoln Financial Advisors.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Blue is the New White podcast. Today we have a returning guest to the show, Mr. Austin Peterson of Backbone Planning Partners. Austin came on the Blue is the New White podcast probably 2.5, 3 years ago. One of our first guests when we were just getting started and had a lot of great information then about growing up in a blue-collar space, and he chose the white-collar route. It was a really great perspective on the right education for the right individual and that everybody defines success in their own way. So we have him back on the show today, 2.5 years later, to talk about his business, Backbone Planning Partners, and some of the businesses that he's helped, how he's helped them, and really focusing in on what separates blue-collar business owners from other business owners and what they need to keep in mind if they're continuing to grow their business, leave their business to family, sell their business, however they're looking to transition, because there are some important things that often get missed in this blue-collar space, especially considering that most of us did it the same way, right? We just, we were good at something, we had a skill, and we monetized that skill and did it all on our own so we could be our own boss, so we could make a little bit more money. And then all of a sudden we had a nice big business on our hands and we had to figure out what to do with it. So Austin joins us today to talk all about that. For more information, visit blueisthenewwhite.com. And as always, this show is not monetized and we don't run ads. We rely strictly on word of mouth from our listeners to further the mission. So if you enjoy this episode, please don't hesitate to share it, review it, and, do all the things that you do to push this episode and this podcast forward. Would really appreciate it. And all the tradespeople out there appreciate it as well. So thank you again and enjoy this episode number 2 with Austin Peterson of Backbone Planning Partners. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Blue is the New White podcast. I've got a returning guest today, Mr. Austin Peterson of Backbone Planning Partners. He joined us, Austin, what was that? It had to be at least 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago?
Yeah, at least 2.5, I would guess, maybe 3. But gosh, with the way that the pandemic happened, I think everybody's kind of skewed on it.
Yeah, I still think it's 2020, so don't ask me. Yeah. But, welcome back to the show, man. I'm glad to have you back and excited to kind of catch up and see what you've been up to and where you're going today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So for those who haven't heard that first episode, because it was way back in the list of episodes there, why don't you just kind of explain who you are, what you do, how you got to where you are today? Give us a little context for what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a smaller town in Utah, and my parents and grandparents were farmers. My dad actually then became a stucco contractor and a mechanic, so he's been kind of in the blue collar fields his whole life. And then, he's actually my stepdad. So my biological father is a truck driver and still is to this day. And so it, kind of runs in my blood, the blue collar ways. But for me, it didn't feel like it was the right path and the direction that I wanted to go. And so, I was actually in high school. I want to say it was my freshman year. I took an entrepreneurship and stock market class, and it kind of just changed my mind as to the direction that I thought that I was going to go. And so, fast forward a few years, freshman year, I was 23 when I first got licensed for financial planning and investment products. So about 9 years later, it took, to get to that point. You can't really jump into the financial arena any younger than that anyhow. So it was young enough at 23, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And based on our last conversation too, you're a big advocate for the blue collar industries. I know you have quite a few blue collar industries, including my own company, in your portfolio of companies that you that are your clients. And you're also a proponent of the right education for the right individual, of course, by which I mean, college and stuff like that. You take a very realistic approach, like I do, with regard to whether a college education is necessary and for whom, right?
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that. I mean, for me and what I wanted to do, a college education was the right direction. I've got a 22-year-old son that is in college now based on what he wanted to do. He's studying sports journalism. But I also have a daughter who went to college for a year, thought that's the direction that she wanted to go, was always a good student, had kind of this plan that she wanted to pursue, and then ran into kind of some health issues with some concussions, et cetera, that made it that much more difficult to be in that learning environment as well. But really it came down to her realizing that what she wanted to do ultimately in working with special needs kids and adults didn't need a college degree. And so she's now, she's working full time with special needs kids and adults, and will probably get some sort of a certificate along the way just to improve her skills and make a little bit more money. But the traditional college route is not the route that she's gonna go.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of aligns, because admittedly, I have a little bit different definition of what a skilled trade is, than most people. Most people consider the skilled trades just the blue collar space, but if you remember in my book, I lay out a couple of different career paths, that I would consider a skilled trade. And really, it boils down to, anything that requires an education of some sort that isn't a college degree, right? So certificates and things like that. And that includes things like hairdressers and dental hygienists, and it sounds like maybe what your daughter is doing as well, if there are certificates available for that.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like you said, I'm a big proponent of the trades period, growing up in a family like that. And like you mentioned, I mean, most of the clients that I work with, even though my trade is technically, considered white collar, most of the clients that we work with are in the blue collar or the trades, for a lot of different reasons. I mean, one of the big reasons is the fact that there are a lot of really well-run, nice companies in the blue collar trades, and they need advice just as much as anybody else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of merit to that. So, out of curiosity, what makes some of these companies what you would consider well run? Is it a profitability thing? Is it a cultural thing? How kind of help me understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's really kind of all of the above, but I would say that there's a difference between, say a solopreneur, right? And, think about, I would consider what my dad built as a solopreneur type of an operation. He really built the company just to provide himself a job, didn't want to work for anybody else, knew that along the way he needed to hire one or two guys to kind of help him with the actual, work. But he wasn't running the organization kind of the same way that you run the organization, where, you're in that CEO office and you're running the business itself rather than the day-to-day operations of the business. And so I would say there's a lot of good groups out there that understand that, if you want to get off your knees or get away from the actual day-to-day work and build an organization, I would call it. Obviously, with that grows revenues, it grows profitability, it professionalizes itself. But it's really those organizations where we spend an awful lot of time. Think of an organization that's got maybe 10 employees or more. Typically, they're going to do revenues. I mean, most of our clients are doing revenues north of 5 million, but maybe they're in that 2 to 3 million range, and they're increasing or growing quickly. That's where we spend an awful lot of time is working with them to take it to that next level. And the reality is most businesses never even make it to that level, right? So they need to be congratulated for what they've built already. But if they truly want to take it to that next level and sell this for life-changing money, then they need some advice along the way.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I can tell you that firsthand. But so that leads me kind of into my next question. What do you see that some of these businesses struggle with? Because I mean, I know I've had my fair share of struggles through the growth of Windy City, and no struggle was the same, right? There were all different types and sizes and shapes of struggles, but is there some commonalities that you see across these blue collar industries?
Yeah, for sure. I think today the publicity is all around, finding skilled laborers and being able to build that, that's an issue. It's even worse today with the Great Resignation, but that's always an issue, right? I mean, finding people that are skilled and are able to do the things, but that you need them to do. But the reality is, most of what I see is business owners who are either unable, unwilling, or not ready to start to take off some of the hats that they wear as a business owner or as the founder or the CEO, and realizing that they can actually take giant leaps forward if they will start to delegate some of the things that they do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can definitely relate to that. And, I'd love to get your perspective on why that might be. I mean, there's so many different reasons. It could be fear, could be just control, could be, that they just love it too much. I mean, what are you seeing out there? Why is it such a struggle, and is it so difficult for some people to step out of that day to day and work on the business, if you will, rather than in the business?
Yeah, I mean, definitely all of the things that you just mentioned come into play, for sure. I mean, the reality is most business owners, regardless of industry, are that type A personality. They're a driver. They're somebody who's out there, who's highly skilled, wants to control their own destiny. That's why they started a business to begin with. And so it's hard to kind of let go of some of those things along the way. But some of it has to do with just not knowing what you don't know, right? I mean, the reality is most business owners, again, regardless of industry, don't have specific training or education in business itself, whether it's accounting, financial training, management, all those types of things, HR. I mean, think about all the different portions of a business that are truly important as you grow. They don't have specific trainings in those areas, but they either don't think they can afford to hire somebody at that point, or they're not willing and ready to let go of those reins at that point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How about you? Has that happened to you in the past?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, outside of my wealth management firm, I've actually owned multiple businesses throughout the years. Still own actually a current business outside of financial planning at this point. And it's the struggles that come along with that are not easy, right? One thing that I don't struggle with is the fact that I know that I need somebody to run the day-to-day of those businesses, because I run the day-to-day of this business. Yeah. And having my time split between the two isn't going to benefit either one of the businesses. And so I've been able to let go of those reins, but that also can potentially come with its own issues. If you don't have the right person in place, you can't fully trust them. They don't have skills and abilities, or you're not giving them enough of your time to communicate your vision for the business. And so, yeah, I mean, I've had struggles, and quite honestly, the reason I do that and always have had a side business is the fact that I think it makes me better equipped to consult with my business owners, because I'm dealing with the same things that they're dealing with in their type of business. But it also is fun for me. I mean, I'm a builder. I enjoy it. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. My chosen field happens to be financial planning, but I'm definitely an entrepreneur at heart.
Yeah. And that's, I see that all the time in the blue collar space, right? And that's usually what happens in our industry is, they start off as a technician or a laborer or whatever it is. They work their way up. They say, hey, I can do this. And then they do. And the special ones, the ones that have that entrepreneurial switch in their head, are the ones that truly end up in the position that you just mentioned earlier, that you can come in and help, right? The $2 to $3 to $5 million range. Because as you alluded, what's the statistic? 90% or so don't make it to that, or 95%, something like that?
Yeah, it's in the high 90s. I mean, it's the reality is 99% of the businesses in our country are considered small businesses,
Yeah.
right? And there are many different definitions. Even if you look at the SBA's website, they have several different definitions of what a small business is. But I mean, you think of the typical business that's out there where it's owner driven and maybe there's a handful of employees, and typically their revenues are below $1 million a year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, what are the biggest differences that you see between a company that, let's say, is $2 million a year compared to a company that's $5 million a year? What has that $5 million company figured out that the $2 million company has not yet?
Yeah, I would say it comes down to two main things that I've seen, and that is understanding the next hire that needs to be in place from an executive team level. And so, along that route, there may have been 2 or 3 hires, but there were hires that were made at that executive level, right? And then processes, repeatable processes, right? I mean, the reason that there's a higher success rate in franchise type businesses compared to just something that you start up on your own is the fact that those franchises have a repeatable process that's laid out for the people who buy those businesses. And so it's putting those processes in place. And sometimes that takes technology and sometimes it doesn't. But you've got to have that repeatable process. It helps with training. It helps with being able to do more and more jobs as time goes on, which ultimately is what drives the top line revenue.
Yeah, that's some really good advice, and my guess is that comes from the experience of working with so many companies, both big and small. So I'm curious. This is kind of, I don't know if this is a wondering or pondering that I had before, but there aren't really many franchised companies in the blue collar space, are there? Or am I wrong in that?
I mean, I think there might be more than you think. There are definitely some franchised companies in HVAC. I owned a franchise in the residential and commercial painting industry back in the day, and so I think that there are definitely some on the plumbing side. So there may be more than we realize. A lot of these companies that we've seen, whether it's call it Roto-Rooter or some of those, a lot of those are franchise type businesses, and they are locally owned. But people don't realize that. They think it's just a big national conglomerate, but it's locally owned by somebody who's running that franchise.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I guess I never really thought about that before, but but that's a really good point. So,
Yeah.
so let's get into, well, I have one more question before we get into what I wanted to get into. So you had mentioned a couple times, you had mentioned having the right people in place to be able to run an organization if you're going to own it, right? And then just one of the 2 pieces of advice that you shared, understanding what your next executive hire is. So I'm curious, in your experience with working with businesses, how often do you see the wrong person in the wrong seat, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, unfortunately, I see it way more than I'd like to see it. I know that business owners themselves, make that mistake more often than they would like, and it can be very detrimental. I think that one positive that's happened over the last decade, call it, is these fractional firms that are set up, whether it's fractional CFO or fractional CMO or whatever the case may be, that the opportunity, fractional HR, right? I mean, they've kind of got them in all areas now. You can actually even get a fractional sales vice president. So there's ways to slowly grow, right? Like you don't have potentially the financials to hire a full-time, really quality person at that level. But if you can get somebody that's a high quality person at that level that would command a much larger salary, but you're only paying a portion of that because you only need them for a few hours, as opposed to hiring somebody that's at a lower experience level, lower overall, benefit to the organization. A lot of companies are going that fractional route and having good success with it.
That's interesting. And I don't, that's relatively new, right? In the past decade or so, maybe a little more. Because I don't know that a lot of business owners really know about the fractional space, at least when they get started, right? Because I certainly didn't. I was under the impression like everybody else, oh, if I want a CFO, I got to hire a CFO. If I want a HR, I got to hire an HR person. But yeah, there are more and more firms popping up to where they can almost act as, that executive seat that you absolutely need. And for the most part, what you're getting, which is interesting. So moving on from that, then, why don't you tell me some of the ways that you've been able to help some of your blue collar clients?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a broad brush to paint with, but most of the clients that are hiring us are ideally in a 3 to 10 year range of when they want to have some sort of a transition in their business, right? And so that transition could be to a member of the family, a son or a daughter who's going to take over the business. That could be sold to a competitor. It could be sold to a strategic member of your, supply chain, for example, or it could be sold, and we're seeing this more and more now, of course, to a private equity group. Some will go public. We've got one client that may go public. That is very rare. I think a lot of people, you see it on the news and you think I'm going to build this technology firm and I'm going to take it public in 5 years or 10 years. And it's typically not realistic, but it's typically planning for that event. Right. And so we spend time with them working through what is that going to take to get the outcome that you're looking for. Right. So let's put a number on it. Let's get an idea of what we think we can build this to. And then it's important to know as the business owner, what is your value gap, right? And that is, what's your net worth today? What do you have in terms of cash and investments today? What do you need to be able to live comfortably for the rest of your life and truly be financially independent? And what's that gap in the middle, right? And so we know we have to sell the business for at least that much. And so we spend time planning for that to get to that point. But there's so many steps along the way. So some of them we talked about, but it's, putting that executive team in place. It's making sure that that executive team, if they're a high quality team, has the incentive to stay, right? Because if an outside buyer is buying the business, they want to know that executive team is going to stay because that's critical to the success of the business, right? And then another thing that we see very often, and it's pretty common. I mean, nobody wants to pay any more in taxes than they have to, right? And I tell clients all the time, there's nothing patriotic about paying more than your fair share and what you actually need to pay. But too many business owners work with their CPAs to get their income so low to where they're paying as little in taxes as possible. But that's at the detriment of the enterprise value of the business a lot of times. Right. And so if it looks like you're not making any money, think about a strategic buyer who comes in and says, now, why am I buying this business? It's got 10 million in revenue, but no profit.
Yeah. That leads me into a really good point. I was going to ask, what are some of the reasons for people transitioning? But I think a better question is, why do you think some of these people start the businesses to begin with? Right. Because I have to assume that maybe the ones you're talking about, especially, right? They don't start the businesses with the intent to sell.
Yeah, they definitely don't. I mean, the classic reason to start a business, you talked about it earlier, right? They're doing the job for a few years and they realize, gosh, you know what? I think I can do this myself. And so they just go out and start it themselves. So they're literally starting the business just to provide themselves a job, earn a little bit more money, and not have to report to anybody else. That's how most businesses in this country get started, right? But what I think about is, Stephen Covey's book where he says, begin with the end in mind, right? And so
that's 7 Habits.
Yeah. And so with that, you just think, well, that to me says that's screaming the word planning. Right. And so you've got to plan from the get-go. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to know exactly what you're doing from the get-go. But if you start the business, you're providing yourself a job and all of a sudden you're realizing, gosh, you know what, I've got kind of a knack for running this business and I'm able to grow it. And man, maybe this does create an incredible legacy for my family. It's at that point where you have to take a step back and say, okay, I just started it just to provide a job, but now I've got the ability to actually build this to something that can be sold. Where do I go and get the advice to build it that right way so that it can be sold? Because the reality is, in our country, less than 20% of all businesses that are listed for sale actually sell.
Really?
Right? Yeah, it's an incredibly low number. And the reality is about 5% of all businesses in our country will ever have a transaction. And so, you know, a lot of companies, my dad's company included, a lot of companies, just when the owner retires, it's dissolved, right? Maybe you sell some assets of the company, but it's typically dissolved because there's not something that's viewed as transferable at that point.
Wow. That's interesting. I didn't realize that the percentage was so low of companies that actually have a transaction. So I imagine, and maybe you can confirm this, but once that realization hits, right? Once somebody starts a business, let's say for the sole purpose of, you know, what you said earlier, they can do it by themselves. They can be their own boss. They can make a little bit more money. You know, once they have the realization that they could build it into something bigger and provide a legacy, you know, for their family, or, you know, possibly offload the business one day, how do business owners handle that transition, that shift in mindset? Because I imagine, you know, that has got to be hard, you know, and I'm trying to draw from personal experience, but, you know, I always had the idea that I was going to grow this business, you know, in my head. So I don't know that I ever went through that particular transition, you know, so I'm just curious from your perspective, how do you see that?
Yeah. So we actually talk about transitioning from an owner mindset to an investor mindset. Right. And so it's not easy. I mean, I don't mean to minimize it and say that it's an easy thing to overcome, but the value of your business goes up in pretty high multiples if you're viewed as an investor in the business rather than an owner. And what I mean by that is, if the business can run with you being in Costa Rica for 6 months and actually have the value increase or the revenues increase or profits or any of the above increase while you're gone, the value of your business goes up considerably. And so once an owner kind of sees that, it's still hard mentally to let go, but once an owner kind of sees that and can see it on paper with examples, then all of a sudden they think, oh, okay, well, I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? Because once you've built a business that is providing you an income and, you know, you're doing pretty well, the next logical step in your mindset is, okay, well, I want to make more money, but I also want to do it with working less, right? And then I want to buy the toys, and then I want to buy, you know, all these sorts of things. And so that's kind of the mindset of an owner in the early stages, or getting beyond, you know, kind of that survival stage. But then you've got to take that next step of, if you truly want to be able to live that kind of a life forever, then you've got to treat this business as an investment. And we talk about the importance of diversifying your holdings, right? The lion's share of all business owners in this country, the largest asset that they hold is their business. And it's not a small percentage of their net worth. It's typically 50 to 100%. And the majority of them are in that 85% or higher of their net worth being tied up in the business, which is an illiquid asset.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. So then what pushes them over the edge? How can they successfully make this shift in mindset to into this investor mindset?
Yeah, it's typically small steps, right? So we'll work with them and say, you know, let's start to take some of this off the table. Let's start to take, you know, 3 weeks of vacation instead of 1. Let's start to take 6 weeks of vacation instead of 3. You know, let's step away for a month at a time and see if the business does okay without you, right? Now, of course, we're having conversations ahead of time, and we're looking into the management team and saying, can the business do that? And if they can't, then you build that team. If they can, then it's about saying, you know what, you need to step away and see that your team does have the ability to do this. They've been trained by you and have the ability to do this. There's an opportunity for you to step away and realize that this could either be an ongoing income stream for you without you needing to be there, right? An absentee ownership type of a deal, or that we can actually sell this for a pretty decent multiple, and just that money will allow you to live comfortably for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden they get it and they're like, okay, I can get there. Still takes steps, and you got to walk before you can run, but they can eventually get there. And one of the phrases that I use quite often is you would never own, put 100% of your net worth or 90% of your net worth in Tesla, right? Everybody loves Tesla. It's been the darling of the stock market, one of the darlings of the stock market for the last 10 years. But then in the last year, it's gone backwards quite a bit. And so people have started to realize, okay, I've got to be careful with Tesla. But even though you believe wholly in Tesla, you would still never put all of your net worth in that one company. Well, that's exactly what business owners do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
no, that's a really good warning, I think, for people out there listening to this show, especially, owners of the small businesses out there. It's very good, to be conscious of that, because you could work for years building the business and just, not really understand exactly what that means. Right. And I'm sure you see that quite a bit in what you do is, so, let's kind of dive into that a little bit about going down the path of what else that you can do to help business owners. You talked about this, getting them ready in the 3 to 10 year, range of transition to sell the business, or, to leave it as a legacy, and we talked about the importance of having your executive team on board and being able to get them to stay with the organization, and having the proper mindset through all of it. What else is important when somebody's considering, transitioning out of their business? What else can they implement in order to set themselves up for success?
Yeah, I mean, outside of the things that we just talked about, I would say that the biggest red flag that you see from an outside buyer who's wanting to look at a business and consider buying it is that their books aren't in order. You got to have very clean books, because, when you go through that due diligence process to sell the business, they're looking at everything. And they want to, not only do they want to see that what you've told them and shown them to that point is legitimate and that you've told the truth to that point, they want to see how you got there, and that it's, they're kept cleanly, they're following accounting standards, and that you've got a team on board that understands how these books should look. And it makes it easier to go through that due diligence process, and it makes a buyer more comfortable saying, okay, this is something that I continue to be interested in, right? Because you got to think about it this way. An outside buyer buys your business based on future cash flows, not what it's done to this point. It's future cash flows, right? And so they've got to trust that the past cash flows and everything that it shows are legitimate. And then an outside buyer, their intent is to say, can I come in and pour some fuel on this fire in some way, shape, or form, whether it's technology, processes, employees, whatever the case may be, so that I can then grow this to a larger multiple, and then probably sell it themselves in 5 to 7 years, especially if it's a private equity group. They want to be able to sell it in 5 to 7 years for like a 5x multiple of what they're buying it from you for.
Yeah. That's good advice. So what do you do when you see somebody and you go to help one of these companies, right? And you walk in and their books are just atrocious, right? And I mean, just all over the place. And listen, I'm speaking from experience here. There was a day and age, when I came into the company that, my dad will be the first one to tell you, and I think he probably has told you, Austin, that he's a mechanic. Before he's a business owner, he's a mechanic, right? So, how do you approach the situation? How do you get these books cleaned up? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so it reminds me actually of a meeting that we had last week with a new prospective client. He owns a trucking company, right? And we go through the conversation, and we ask our normal data gathering questions, and those questions aren't just to gather data; it's to see how they're responded to, and then obviously what data is provided. But along the way, we get some ideas about what's going on internally and how well prepared they are from a financial standpoint. And if the person preparing their financials is doing a good job. And, there were some potential red flags with this prospective client anyway. And so I found myself on the fence as to whether or not this was the direction that we wanted to go, to even give him the opportunity to engage with us. But one of the things that I explained to him was, if we were to move forward, you've got to be comfortable with the fact that we're putting together this team, and you might have members of that team already, right? It might be your CFO, it might be your outside CPA, it might be your bookkeeper, it might be your business attorney, your estate planning attorney, but all of those people are members of the team. But here's the thing that you need to understand, and this is a very bold way that I typically wouldn't put it with a client, but I said, you need to understand that I, or we, if my partner's involved, we are the quarterback of that team. And you've got to be comfortable with us coming to you and saying, that person is not up to muster for what we need. And if you aren't comfortable with knowing that you need somebody better than who you currently have to get your business to the next level, then there's no reason for us to continue to have this conversation. And so, it really comes down to that: is, do you have the right level of expertise, right? On my podcast, Tycoons of Small Biz, I had a guest on this week that runs a CPA firm, right? And the difference between the CPA industry and the legal industry is that people know that there's a difference between personal injury and real estate law and, business law, estate planning, but CPA gets lumped into one area, right? Everybody, you're a CPA, you can do everything I need from an accounting standpoint and a financial standpoint. It's just not the case. Right. And so we come across that quite often, where there's CPAs who have an expertise level that's here, and then there are CPAs that have an expertise level that's here. And if they don't have the right expertise, or they're not providing the right services and the right advice, then you've got to be willing to make that change and know that it's going to lead to a better outcome for the business.
Yeah. Those have got to be some really hard conversations, because a lot of times they're ingrained relationships, right? I would imagine, that there's a lot of instances that people have built their team based on referrals from people or friends or, something of that nature, but not necessarily industry specific or whatnot. And so, that's got to be tough for some people to swallow that pill.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's obviously not easy for us to have that conversation either. We have to approach it very delicately, specifically if it's a relationship like you described, right? It's, they're our neighbor, or I went to high school with him, or, whatever. But when it comes down to it, I mean, you don't choose your OBGYN because they live next door to you when you're in a high risk pregnancy with your wife. You choose an OBGYN based on them being the best in their field that you can get access to.
Yeah. And that's a good way to put it. And I think that's probably the best way that people will understand, based on what you're saying. Wow. That's super interesting. So you say that when companies are purchased, buyers want a company for the future cash flows, the cash flows that aren't yet, but maybe attainable. Are you also involved in, kind of that process and helping find synergies, if you will, through the exit, or do you bring the business up to the exit and then kind of hand it off?
Well, it kind of depends, right? So if the purchaser of the business, so say the business that's selling is my client,
Mm-hmm.
if the purchaser of the business isn't engaging me and they can't engage me during that process, right? That's a conflict of interest.
Sure.
But if they decide that they want to engage our services after the sale, then certainly we can help them with that. But typically what happens is, we're continuing to work with the business owner that we helped sell their business to either buy and or build a different business, or to invest the proceeds at that point. And of course, well before the actual transaction, I should say, doing everything that we can to offset taxes at that point and plan for their ultimate family and estate going forward.
Interesting. And what do you find mostly when you help your clients with an exit like that? What do you find most often that they do? And I'm interested in this because you work typically with entrepreneurs, right? Do you find that they need to find something else to sink their teeth into, or is it usually a retirement play? What do you see?
Yeah, so it's funny you should say that, because we use a slide in so we're obviously doing a lot of PowerPoint presentations, and we got into that when we were doing or during the pandemic, right? So when you and I engaged the first time, it was in person, and it's essentially all been in person. But now we do a bunch on Zoom, and so we have a slide that talks about kind of the whole person, if you will, and not just the business owner. And a part of that is understanding that when the phone stops ringing and you're not the person in charge anymore, and you don't have to run the organization, that can create a major void in your life. And you need to fill that void with something, right? And so sometimes it is that they just want to build another business, and it's typically going to be in another industry, because you're typically going to sign a non-compete if you're selling your business, right? But so maybe it's starting another business, but a lot of it is, what else do you care about? Do you want to travel with family, which is great. Everybody wants to do that, but that kind of just, the luster wears off in 6 months or so at a maximum. Golf, I'm passionate about golf. Well, that kind of, becomes boring at some point as well. And so is there a charity that's really important to you? Is your religion or your faith important to you? Are there things that you can do to be involved there? Can you and your spouse or significant other travel and, help people in poor countries? There's a lot of different things, but you have to have something to replace that with. The statistics, actually, it's now I can't remember if it's PricewaterhouseCooper or Deloitte & Touche that put it out, but they've got this study that says that regardless of transaction size, regardless of how much money they got, if they were fully financially independent, very, very wealthy, the average business owner, after selling their business 18 months later, profoundly regrets having done so.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. And it's that void. They weren't prepared to fill that void with something else. You've got to know mentally what's next. Wow. Because it consumes you. Building a business consumes you. Most business owners have families, and families are important too. And, we can get into the statistics of divorce and broken families and all those kinds of things in business, because it's a really, really stressful way to live your life, right? And so you've got to focus on that during the building phase as well. But you're really, quote unquote, married to your business, right? I mean, I have a business partner. I spend more time with my business partner. I know you spend more time with your business partner, your dad, than you do with your spouse and your kids. And so that really is your life for that period of time. You've got to have something to replace it, or it can lead to some negative outcomes.
Yeah. No, that's profound. It makes sense. Right. I mean, when I'm looking at it, from my perspective, growing this business, right? It's consumed me for the last 13 years. It's all I've done. If I were to sell tomorrow, it's not the case. All right. Quit knocking on the door, guys. But if I were to sell tomorrow, I don't know, I would have that void. I absolutely would. And listen, I'm a young guy, so I would find something else to do right away, but I couldn't not, right? And I think that is a commonality amongst entrepreneurs and business owners, that they have that void. Maybe they're born with it, for all I know, and it just always has to be filled. So it makes a lot of sense. I just never really sat to, stop to think about what the statistics actually were after the sale. So super, super interesting. So I can't believe we've already been talking for almost an hour. That's unbelievable. So before we wrap up the episode, is there anything that you were hoping to hit on that we didn't touch on today?
No, I don't think so. I mean, honestly, there's, as a practice, we do all the things that everybody thinks that financial planners do, right? I mean, we're going to help with retirement planning. We're going to handle investments. We're going to sell insurance. We're going to do all those kinds of things that are really, really important. But what's unique about our firm and the reason we're called Backbone Planning Partners is because we're committed to the small business community, right? What's important to understand is that most financial planners don't get involved with business owners at all until maybe 6 months before they sell their business, because they can see a transaction on the horizon. They can see investments to manage. They can see, some planning to do. But the reality is succession planning or exit planning for a business is not an event. It's a process, right? And so most business owners should engage our services or a firm like ours 3 to 10 years before they're looking to sell the business in an ideal situation.
Yeah. And that's good information. And I think that's one of those things that people just don't think about. So it's good that you bring it up, because that's something that, quite honestly, all business owners need to hear. Preparation is key. What do they say? Failing to prepare is preparing to fail.
Yep, exactly.
So well said, Austin. I really appreciate that. So with that being said, I think that we'll go ahead and wrap up the show today, but I really want to thank you for coming on and again, for the second time, and sharing your infinite wisdom with my audience. It's much appreciated, and I know that they'll appreciate it too. I've got a lot of small business owners that listen to this show that will gain a ton of knowledge and insight from what you had to say today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the invite. I obviously appreciate the relationship. I appreciate what you do for the blue collar trades and so forth, everything where you're involved there. I'll actually just mention, if you'll allow me, one more thing. If any of your audience members, small business owners that are listening, have a desire to be on my podcast, Tycoons of Small Biz, we would welcome having a conversation about that as well.
Absolutely. And I can put anybody in touch with Austin if they want to have further conversations, or obviously if they want to be on his show. So just feel free to reach out to me. You know where to find me. Speaking of where to find me, Austin, where can they find you?
Yeah, best place, website is backboneplanning.com. So just like it sounds, backboneplanning.com. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. My name's very common, but if you type Austin Peterson, Peterson CFP, like Certified Financial Planner, you'll find me pretty easily. If you leave the CFP off, you might find a comedian with the same name. So, I would like to actually become a stand-up comedian on the side at some point. I think that would be fun, but this guy's actually making a career of it at this point. So.
Right on. Well, Austin, thank you again so much for coming on the show and sharing all that with our audience today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh.